The land we now call Egypt was once just a ribbon of green threading through a world of sun-bleached rock and sand. The Nile, endless and mysterious, flooded with a rhythm more faithful than any god, turning arid banks into fields rich with black silt. This land was not just fertile, it was sacred, and it was here, more than 5,000 years ago, that one of the world's longest-running civilizations took root in mud-brick villages, in reed boats drifting on flooded waters, and in the dreams of kings. Around 3100 BCE, something astonishing happened. Two lands, Upper Egypt in the south, where the Nile runs narrow through cliffs, and Lower Egypt in the north, where it fans into a vast delta, were unified. The man credited with this unification was Narmer, a ruler whose name and deeds are still debated. He appears on the famed Narmer palette, a ceremonial artifact depicting him as a conqueror of both lands. He wears the white crown of Upper Egypt in one scene, the red crown of Lower Egypt in another symbolic mastery carved into stone. But who was Narmer? Really? Was he a single historical king, or a composite figure, an echo of several rulers blended into legend? Some historians believe that Narmer and the later mentioned Menes were the same man, while others argue that Menes came later and finalised what Narmer began. The truth is buried in the sands, and perhaps deliberately so. What we do know is this from this moment of unification. Egypt began to think like a state. Power was centralised. Irrigation became organised. Taxes, often in the form of grain, were collected and redistributed, and temples rose, housing both priests and state records. The Egyptians didn't call themselves Egyptians. They called their land Kemet, the Black Land, named for the rich soil left by the Nile's floods. To them, the river was not just a waterway. It was a god. It flowed from south to north, reversing the compass, reversing expectations, and shaping everything. Life clung to its banks. Beyond them lay the Deshret, the red land, the barren desert, the realm of chaos and death. In this early era, writing emerged not just as a form of communication, but as a tool of divine authority. Hieroglyphs, sacred carvings appeared in tombs, on temple walls, and on administrative seals. The king was not just a ruler. He was the Nesubiti, the living embodiment of divine automat, and his word, when carved into stone, carried a permanence unmatched by any throne. And here is something remarkable. The ancient Egyptians were obsessed with time. Not just linear time, the kind that begins and ends, but cyclical time. To them, the past could return. The floods would always rise. The stars would return to their positions. And if rituals were performed correctly, the king could rise again too. From these beliefs would rise the first tombs, the first rituals of mummification, and a cultural obsession with death that, paradoxically, allowed Egyptian civilization to live for millennia. But it all started here with a man whose true identity remains a mystery, a stretch of river that defied the desert, and a people who saw the divine in the dirt. By the dawn of the Third Dynasty, Egypt had become something the world had never seen before, a centralized kingdom ruled by divine kings, structured by bureaucracy, and obsessed with permanence. And then came something even more audacious, architecture that defied death. It began with a single idea that a king could be made eternal in stone. Around 2670 BCE, Pharaoh Djoser commissioned the construction of a funerary complex that would forever change the skyline of ancient Egypt. He entrusted the project to his high priest and vizier, a polymath named Imhotep, a man whose legacy would transcend millennia. Imhotep's creation, the step pyramid at Saqqara, was unlike anything built before. Instead of a flat mastaba-style tomb, he designed 6 stone platforms stacked in receding layers, rising like steps toward the heavens. This was the world's first large-scale stone building, and it was more than a tomb. It was a statement. The step pyramid was part of a vast complex complete with courtyards, temples, and ceremonial halls, all enclosed by a massive limestone wall. The pharaoh's body would rest deep within a subterranean maze, while above, Rituals of rebirth and continuity would be performed for eternity. For the ancient Egyptians, the king did not die. He transformed, becoming a star in the northern sky, a god sailing with Ra across the heavens. An Imhotep, he became a legend. Thousands of years later, during the Greco-Roman period, he would be worshipped as a demigod of wisdom and medicine. His name would be spoken in the same breath as Asclepius and Hippocrates. But why build in stone? Why the obsession with scale? Some argue that these pyramids were symbolic mountain stairways for the soul, mimicking the primordial mound that emerged from the chaotic waters in Egyptian creation myths. Others suggest they were visual anchors of the king's divine power, visible for miles, proclaiming control over land, labour and time. And here's a quirky truth the builders of these massive monuments often left behind unexpected details. In the tunnels beneath Djoser's pyramid, archaeologists have found graffiti playful sketches of animals and jokes scrawled by the workers. Immortality may have been the goal, but humanity always left its fingerprint. Still, one debate lingers: were these projects built purely for religious reasons? Or were they political machines, monuments of fear and control? While it's tempting to romanticize the pyramids as noble dreams of eternity, some scholars point to their role in reinforcing the absolute power of the king. The sheer coordination required to quarry, transport, and position these stones often over long distances speaks to a tightly controlled economy and society. The pyramid wasn't just a tomb, it was a national project, a unifying force, and a visible symbol of divine order. From this moment forward, Egyptian kings would compete to outdo one another not in battle, but in stone. Their immortality depended on it. By the 4th dynasty, ambition had reached cosmic proportions. Pharaoh Khufu, known to the Greeks as Cheops, would commission what remains today the last surviving wonder of the ancient world, the Great Pyramid at Giza, built around 2560 BCE. It was a structure so colossal, so mathematically precise, that even today we struggle to grasp how it was done. Rising over 480 feet, composed of more than 2 million limestone blocks, each weighing between 2 to 15 tons, the Great Pyramid once gleamed with polished white casing stones that reflected the Egyptian sun like a beacon of divine power. For centuries, it stood as the tallest human-made structure in the world, and yet, strangely, for all its grandeur, the interior is stark, empty corridors, angular shafts, and no inscriptions. Unlike later tombs decorated with hymns and sacred spells, Khufu's pyramid is silent. Some have called it the mute monument, as if its message was meant to be seen, not read. How was it built? This remains one of Egypt's most enduring mysteries. Theories abound, from massive ramps to counterweight systems, but no blueprint has ever been found. What we do know is this: the workforce was not composed of slaves, as long assumed. Evidence from nearby worker villages suggests something very different: well-fed labourers housed in barracks, provided with medical care, and even buried with honour. These were likely seasonal workers, farmers who, when the Nile flooded their fields, took part in a national project of spiritual significance and state propaganda. Here lies the controversy. Was this a marvel of social unity or a symbol of state coercion? Some scholars see the Great Pyramid as proof of Egypt's sophisticated statecraft, a centralised economy, logistical brilliance, and a collective belief in the divine role of the king. Others argue it reflects authoritarian excess, a monument to a ruler who drained the labour of a nation to secure his name in eternity. And yet, the pyramid endures not just as a marvel of engineering, but as a cultural compass. Its alignment is nearly perfect with the cardinal points. Its proportions mirror mysterious mathematical constants, like pi and the golden ratio. Whether by intent or accident, the Great Pyramid seems to encode within its mass the very laws of the cosmos. Here's a lesser-known curiosity. Tiny air shafts built into the pyramid don't align with ventilation needs, they align with specific stars. One shaft points to Orion's belt associated with Osiris, god of the afterlife, another to Sirius, the goddess Isis. Khufu's tomb was more than a grave. It was a celestial engine connecting the soul of the king with the heavens. But in chasing eternity, even stone has its limits. Later pharaohs would struggle to match Khufu's ambition. The pyramids that followed grew smaller, simpler, more prone to collapse. The dream of building heaven on earth would soon give way to new forms of spiritual architecture, ones that embraced interior symbolism over exterior mass. Still, Khufu's pyramid stands wind-scoured, stripped of its polished casing, yet proud. It is a riddle in stone, a monument to faith, ego, power, and mystery. If the pyramids were the body of ancient Egypt, then religion was its soul, intricate, adaptive, and deeply political. In a world where the desert could swallow cities and the Nile could both nourish and destroy, the ancient Egyptians sought not control, but balance. This concept may have governed everything: law, justice, truth, cosmic order. And at the centre of it all stood the pharaoh, not merely a ruler, but the embodiment of Maat itself. His duty wasn't just to govern it, was to maintain harmony between gods and humans, earth and sky. Egyptian religion wasn't rigid, it evolved, absorbed, and regionalised. Gods multiplied. They took on overlapping identities. Ra, the sun god, was not separate from Horus, the sky god at times. They fused into Ra-Harakti. Isis, the divine mother, was both a mourning sister and a protector of the throne. Osiris, lord of the dead, had once ruled the earth before being dismembered by his brother, set a tale retold endlessly in temple walls and funerary hymns. And while the pantheon sprawled, it was no chaos. It mirrored the state. Priesthoods rose in parallel with royal authority. Temples, though spiritual in function, also acted as administrative centres. They stored grain, issued loans, employed scribes, and maintained vast landholdings. In Thebes, the cult of Amun became so powerful that it rivaled the king himself. Some temples grew so wealthy they were essentially states within the state. Here lies a key debate. Did religion drive Egyptian politics, or was it a tool manipulated by pharaohs to justify their rule? For example, Pharaoh Sneferu, father of Khufu, styled himself as a divine provider, staging ceremonial hunts and presenting himself as a protector of Maat. But behind the myth, he launched massive building campaigns and military raids into Nubia. Was he a pious king or simply cloaking expansionist ambition in divine language? Still, the power of religion in Egypt was not just institutional, it was deeply personal. In every village, household shrines held figures of protective deities. Bes, the dwarf god who scared off evil spirits. Taweret, the hippopotamus goddess of childbirth. Festivals were held where sacred boats were paraded down the Nile. Music thundered from tambourines, and common people glimpsed the hidden statues of their gods. Religion was not abstract. It lived in rhythm with life and death. One of the more curious religious practices was the ritual opening of the mouth performed on mummies. Priests believed that by touching the lips of the deceased with sacred tools, they restored their senses for the afterlife so they could speak, eat, and breathe again beyond the veil of death. But even in religion, cracks could appear. Some scholars argue that Egypt's deeply entwined religious political system prevented innovation, that it prized tradition so highly it became rigid in the face of external change. Others counter that this very devotion to continuity created a civilization more stable than any before or since. Whatever the truth, religion in Egypt was never just about gods. It was about order, about how to survive a dangerous world, about giving the king the divine mandate to rule and the people the rituals to endure. In the sands of Egypt, gods did not descend from the heavens. They rose from the river, they walked the temples, they rode with the sun, and in that sacred balance, the state was born. After the grandeur of the Old Kingdom and its colossal pyramids, Egypt entered a time of fragmentation. Local governors, called nomarchs, grew increasingly independent. Famine, political unrest, and weak rulers eroded central authority. For a century, chaos reigned. But from this disarray rose a new order, one not carved in stone, but written on papyrus and organised in ledgers. Around 2055 BCE, a southern prince named Mentuhotep II of Thebes reunited the country, marking the dawn of the Middle Kingdom. Where earlier kings built monuments to heaven, the new pharaohs turned their gaze to the land, focusing on governance, infrastructure, and reform. The Middle Kingdom is often called Egypt's classical age, a time of flourishing literature, legal systems, and refined art. Power became more institutional than personal. Viziers and scribes grew in importance. Every transaction from grain rations to canal repairs was recorded in precise script. Egypt had become a state of paperwork, and with paperwork came policy. Irrigation projects expanded, particularly around the Fayum, a vast depression west of the Nile. Canals diverted floodwaters into new farmland, increasing food production and stabilizing the economy. The state took an active role in social order, issuing standardized weights, auditing grain silos, and coordinating labor during flood season. Here's an unexpectedly human detail. Many officials were buried with Shabti figurines, tiny servant statues, often inscribed with spells, meant to do chores for them in the afterlife. Some tombs held hundreds of these little workers, each frozen mid-task grinding grain, carrying baskets, rowing boats. Bureaucracy, it seems, didn't end with death. This period also saw the growth of middle-class burials. While the Old Kingdom reserved elaborate tombs for the elite, the Middle Kingdom extended funerary practices to scribes, artisans, and even prosperous farmers. Death became democratized in theory, at least, but there's a quiet controversy among Egyptologists. Was this flourishing truly a golden age, or just a better documented one? The Middle Kingdom's focus on order and control produced more surviving texts than any era before it. We have accounting scrolls, land surveys, even letters between family members. Some scholars argue this abundance creates an illusion that earlier periods were just as complex, but left fewer records. Others suggest the Middle Kingdom marked a genuine philosophical shift, a move from divine absolutism to administrative pragmatism. Consider the instruction of Amenemhat, a didactic text attributed to a king who warns his son that no one is safe, not even a pharaoh. The tone is cautious, almost paranoid, a far cry from the bombast of Old Kingdom inscriptions. Power was no longer guaranteed by bloodline or divine aura. It had to be managed. Still, the state's reach extended far even into the afterlife. Tomb art from this period reveals a striking realism. Scenes show men dragging boats through marshes, women grinding flour, children playing by the riverbank. These weren't just visions of heaven, they were affirmations of a life well lived. The Egyptians had begun to imagine paradise not as some far-off other world, but as a perfected version of the world they knew. And perhaps that was the Middle Kingdom's true innovation, the belief that stability on earth was as sacred as eternity in the stars. In the balance between heaven and ledger, the Nile Valley found something rare, a civilization governed not just by gods or kings, but by the written word and a belief in order. If the pyramids were Egypt's monuments of stone, then the Middle Kingdom gave rise to its monuments of the mind stories, poems, wisdom texts, and letters that captured not only the beliefs of a civilization, but its anxieties, its hopes, and its humour. Among these literary treasures, none stands out more than the tale of Sinuhe. First copied during the reign of Senusret III around 1960 BCE, it has been called the first true piece of historical fiction in world literature. And unlike the grand inscriptions of kings and gods, this story speaks with a human voice. Sinuhe was a court official who fled Egypt under mysterious circumstances after the death of a pharaoh. He wandered into foreign lands, lived among nomadic tribes, rose to prominence abroad, and yet was haunted by homesickness. In his old age, he pleaded to return, to be buried beside his ancestors along the Nile. The tale is rich with drama, exile, identity, diplomacy, and it ends not with conquest, but with reconciliation. Sinuhe is welcomed back. The pharaoh forgives him. He receives a tomb and burial rites in his homeland. What makes this story extraordinary is its emotional depth. It doesn't just glorify Egypt, it questions it. What does it mean to belong to serve a king to age in exile? Some scholars believe the tale of Sinuhe was propaganda in disguise, a way to affirm royal clemency and divine order. Others argue it reflects a new awareness of the individual, a rare thing in a world dominated by collective ideology and state theology. Here's a curious detail: copies of Sinuhe's story were found on schoolboy practice tablets. It became part of the curriculum for scribes in training the ancient Egyptian equivalent of a coming-of-age novel. Young minds learned the art of language by copying the tale of a man who longed for home. But Sinuhe's was not the only voice to rise from this period. Egyptian literature bloomed. There were love poems comparing the beloved to lotus flowers, filled with playful eroticism and gentle longing. There were wisdom texts like the Instruction of Ptahhotep, filled with practical advice: be humble, listen more than you speak, respect your elders. And there were lamentations, like the dialogue of a man with his bar, where a man contemplates suicide and debates with his own soul. This last one is especially striking: raw, philosophical, almost existential. It shows that behind the serenity of temples and the formality of rituals, there was room in Egyptian thought for doubt, for personal struggle, even for melancholy. Still, literature served a purpose beyond introspection. It trained the state scribes, the elite class of literate administrators who managed the gears of empire. In a world without printing presses, to write was to wield power. Scribes were honoured in poems, depicted in tombs, and sometimes even outranked warriors. Yet, a scholarly debate remains. Was this literary renaissance confined to the elite, or was it more widespread? Certainly, reading and writing were privileges. Most of the population remained illiterate, but the widespread copying of texts like Sinuhe and the appearance of similar themes in tombs, art, and even graffiti suggest that stories filtered through society in other ways through oral traditions, public recitations, and festivals. Egypt had discovered something profound: that stories could carry not only memory, but meaning. That tales of flight and forgiveness could bind a people together more powerfully than stone. And in doing so, they began to shape something that would outlast even pyramids, a culture. For centuries, Egypt had been the unshakable power along the Nile stable, unified and self-contained. But around 1650 BCE, that illusion cracked. A new force emerged in the north: foreign rulers known as the Hyksos. Their arrival marked the beginning of Egypt's second intermediate period, a time when native kings in Thebes ruled only part of the country, while outsiders controlled the delta and the ancient capital of Memphis. Who were these Hyksos? The term itself comes from an Egyptian phrase meaning rulers of foreign lands. They likely originated from the Levant Canaanite peoples, who had long traded with, settled in, and gradually assimilated into Lower Egypt. Their rise to power was less of a sudden invasion than a creeping accumulation of influence traders becoming governors becoming kings. Yet their presence was revolutionary. The Hyksos brought with them technologies Egypt had never seen before. They introduced the horse-drawn chariot light, fast and deadly. They wielded composite bows, capable of shooting farther and with more force than traditional Egyptian arms. They built fortified cities with ramparts and towers, altering the architectural landscape. And they adopted Egyptian customs, gods, and titles, all while ruling from their own capital at Avaris. To Egyptians in the south, this was a cultural and political crisis. For the first time in recorded history, Egypt was ruled by foreigners. But here's the twist: the Hyksos didn't simply destroy Egyptian civilization, they integrated with it. They respected the gods, maintained temples, and minted coins with traditional iconography. Some even married into local nobility. Still, their rule left deep scars. Later Egyptian texts, especially from the New Kingdom, portray the Hyksos as brutal invaders who desecrated temples and ravaged the land. But many scholars believe these accounts were exaggerated propaganda crafted to justify later wars of liberation. And that leads us to the controversy: were the Hyksos oppressors or participants in Egypt's political evolution? Some historians argue that their rule stimulated Egypt's eventual transformation into a true military power. The need to reclaim lost territory spurred the development of new weapons, tactics, and national identity. In short, the humiliation of foreign rule taught Egypt how to become an empire. There's also a fascinating irony. Much of what we think of as quintessentially Egyptian warfare chariots, composite bows, scale armour were Hyksos imports. Amid this turbulence, one unexpected figure rose: Queen Ahotep, mother of the Theban prince Kamose. According to inscriptions, she rallied troops, quelled rebellions, and held Upper Egypt together in a time of war. Her memory was honoured with golden flies, military medals awarded for bravery. Eventually, her sons Kamose and Ahmose, I led the campaign that pushed the Hyksos out. It wasn't just a military victory, it was a cultural catharsis. Ahmose's conquest of Avaris and the reunification of Egypt in 1550 BCE marked the end of the Second Intermediate Period and the dawn of the new kingdom, Egypt's imperial age. The lesson of the Hyksos lingered. Never again would Egypt be so inward-looking. Foreign lands would no longer be threats, they would become targets. But the shock of the Hyksos was deeper than politics. It forced Egypt to see itself from the outside, to confront the vulnerability of even the most ancient order. And in that crucible of disruption, a new Egypt was born, one that would soon dominate the ancient world. When Ahmose expelled the Hyksos and re-established native rule, he didn't just restore Egypt, he transformed it. The trauma of foreign occupation had redefined the national psyche. No longer would Egypt rely on natural borders for safety. Instead, it would create a buffer not of sand or stone, but of conquest. Thus began the 18th dynasty, and with it, the new kingdom, Egypt's most glorious and aggressive era. It was no longer content to be a kingdom of the Nile. It would become an empire. The man who embodied this vision most fully was Thutmose III, often called the Napoleon of ancient Egypt. His reign, from 1479 to 1425 BCE, was a whirlwind of military campaigns, administrative reforms, and cultural expansion. When his stepmother and co-regent Hatshepsut died, Thutmose launched a series of annual military expeditions into the Levant and Syria, 17 in total, bringing dozens of city-states under Egyptian control. One of the most legendary moments of his campaigns was the Battle of Megiddo. There, Thutmose faced a coalition of rebellious Canaanite kings. Instead of taking the longer, safer routes to the city, he chose a narrow mountain pass, a bold and dangerous move. It worked. The enemy was caught off guard, and Megiddo fell after a 7-month siege. Thutmose marked the victory with inscriptions and even had the battlefield's geography mapped out, an early example of military cartography. But he wasn't just a warrior, he was a statesman. After each conquest, he didn't raise cities, he absorbed them. He took hostages, installed loyal rulers, and brought back tribute gold, cattle, horses, exotic plants, and artisans. Temples in Karnak and Luxor were adorned with scenes of tribute from Nubia, Syria, and beyond. Egypt's temples became not only places of worship, but museums of imperial pride. One unexpected find from his reign: botanical gardens. Thutmose ordered entire trees and plants uprooted and transported from foreign lands back to Egypt. He had them planted in temple courtyards, living trophies of conquest. This was not just an empire of swords, but of symbols. And yet, controversy follows even a king of such magnitude. For years, his rule was overshadowed by Hatshepsut, the woman who ruled before him. Some believe Thutmose resented her power. After her death, many of her statues were defaced, her name chiselled off monuments. Was this the work of Thutmose himself, or later officials eager to cleanse the official record of a female king? Scholars continue to debate whether he was complicit or merely allowed it to happen. Regardless, Thutmose III solidified Egypt as the preeminent power in the ancient Near East. He established permanent garrisons in Canaan, demanded annual tribute from vassal states, and made Egypt not just a kingdom, but a superpower. Still, Egypt did not become Rome. It didn't seek to colonize through cultural erasure. Local rulers kept their traditions. Egypt asked for loyalty, tribute, and deference to its gods, but allowed space for diversity. Herein lies a subtle paradox. While Egypt expanded outward, its worldview remained deeply insular. Foreign lands were judged by how they fit into the Egyptian cosmic order. Conquered princes bowed to Pharaoh not just politically, but ritually, even in victory. Egypt didn't abandon its view of itself as the centre of the world, the place where the gods had touched earth. And yet, these conquests made Egypt wealthier, more cosmopolitan, and more ambitious than ever before. Under Thutmose III, the Nile no longer marked the edge of Egypt's world, it became its spine. From the Euphrates to the Fourth Cataract, the son of Ra rose on an empire built by kings, chariots, scrolls, and gods. Amid the long line of kings who wore the double crown of Egypt, one name stands out not for her conquests, but for her confidence, her cunning, and the architectural legacy she left in stone. Hatshepsut. She ruled Egypt not as queen, but as pharaoh, taking on the full titles, regalia, and divine associations traditionally reserved for men. Her reign, from approximately 1479 to 1458 BCE, defied expectation and redefined power in the ancient world. Hatshepsut began as regent for her young stepson, Thutmose III, but within a few years she had claimed the throne for herself. She commissioned grand monuments that depicted her with a false beard and masculine body visual cues not of deception, but of legitimacy. She was not pretending to be male. She was becoming what the role required, the embodiment of divine kingship. Her most enduring creation was the mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahari, a terraced, colonnaded structure that rose in elegant layers from the base of a limestone cliff near Thebes. It is one of the architectural wonders of the ancient world, blending harmony with grandeur, engineering with devotion. The walls are covered in vibrant reliefs depicting her divine birth, her coronation, and perhaps most fascinating of all, her expedition to the land of Punt. The voyage to Punt, likely along the coast of modern-day Eritrea or Somalia, brought back incense trees, exotic animals, ebony, and gold. Inscriptions describe the journey as a triumph of divine favour, but it was also a masterstroke of soft power. Instead of military conquest, Hatshepsut used trade to expand Egypt's wealth and global image. Among the curiosities in these scenes is the portrayal of the Queen of Punt, depicted with unusual physical proportions and elaborate jewellery, offering gifts to Hatshepsut's delegation. It's a moment of cultural exchange frozen in paint and still debated by scholars today. Yet Hatshepsut's reign wasn't without controversy. Was she a usurper? Did she deny her stepson his rightful throne? The historical record is murky. Inscriptions from her reign present a seamless narrative of divine legitimacy. But years after her death, many of her statues were smashed, and her name was chiselled out from monuments. For a long time, scholars blamed Thutmose III, assuming he sought revenge once he gained full control. But recent theories suggest the erasure may have come later, under the priesthood or successors who felt uncomfortable with her precedent. Not because she failed, but because she succeeded too well. Still, her legacy endures not just in stone, but in governance. Hatshepsut maintained peace, oversaw vast building campaigns, reopened trade routes, and kept the state running smoothly. She ruled for over 2 decades longer than many male pharaohs. One lesser-known fact, she had herself depicted as both daughter of a god and a beloved of the goddess Hathor, asserting her spiritual authority from both paternal and maternal sources. She didn't just step into the male role of king, she expanded the very language of legitimacy. Today, many see Hatshepsut not just as a powerful woman in a man's world, but as a ruler who redefined what Egyptian leadership could look like. In doing so, she left behind more than a temple. She left a question one Egypt would answer only reluctantly: could power be defined by ability, not by gender? The Nile flowed steadily during her reign. The temples gleamed, and for a generation, Egypt bowed not to a warlord but to a builder, a diplomat, and a woman who dared to call herself king. In a civilization known for its unwavering devotion to tradition, Few figures stirred as much disruption as Akhenaten, the so-called heretic king. His reign in the mid-14th century BCE fractured centuries of religious orthodoxy, redrew the artistic canon, and reshaped the very relationship between god and king. And it all began with the son. Born as Amenhotep IV, son of Pharaoh, Amenhotep III and Queen Tae, the young ruler inherited a stable empire at the height of its wealth and influence. But within just 5 years of his reign, he initiated one of the most radical transformations in ancient history. He changed his name to Akhenaten, effective for the Aten, and shifted state worship toward a singular solar deity, Aten, the disk of the sun. The Aten had existed in earlier texts as a manifestation of the sun god Ra, but Akhenaten elevated this one aspect above all others. He declared Aten the sole god, abolishing or marginalizing the traditional pantheon. The temples of Amun, the powerful state deity, were closed. Offerings ceased. The priesthood, long a power in its own right, was sidelined, and in a bold move, Akhenaten abandoned Thebes and built a new capital from scratch. Akhenaten horizon of the Aten known today as Amarna. The city was constructed swiftly on virgin land between cliffs, with open-air temples designed to allow sunlight to pour in an architectural embodiment of the god's presence. Here's a quirky yet striking feature of the Amarna period. Its art broke radically from Egyptian conventions. Figures were shown with elongated heads, narrow torsos, full hips, and exaggerated features. Akhenaten himself was depicted with an almost androgynous form, slouched, soft, and strangely human. Some scenes showed him playing with his daughters, kissing his wife Nefertiti, or basking in sunbeams. No other pharaoh had ever been portrayed with such domestic vulnerability. This raises enduring questions. Was Akhenaten depicting divine transformation? Was he ill? Or was he challenging aesthetic norms, deliberately blurring gender, hierarchy, and divinity into a new theological vision? Some scholars have called him history's first monotheist. Others disagree, noting that he was not promoting universal morality, but enforcing devotion to a single god embodied by the king himself. This was not so much a revolution of belief as it was of control, and therein lies the controversy. Was Akhenaten a visionary reformer or a political radical? Critics of his reign point to its isolationism. Foreign correspondence like the famous Amarna letters reveal vassal states begging Egypt for aid, while the king seemingly ignored them. Egypt's military strength weakened. Tribute from Syria and Palestine slowed. The empire that had been built through centuries of diplomacy and conquest began to fray. Meanwhile, ordinary Egyptians who had worshipped deities like Hathor, Bastet, and Osiris for generations were alienated. The new religion was royal, abstract, and exclusive. But Akhenaten wasn't alone. His queen, Nefertiti, played a powerful role. In several depictions, she appears making offerings to Aten or even striking enemies' acts traditionally reserved for kings. Some believe she may have ruled alongside him as a co-regent, and after his death, there's evidence that a woman, possibly Nefertiti herself, ruled as Pharaoh Nefer-Nefer-Uaten. Eventually, Akhenaten's religious experiment collapsed. His successors, including the boy king Tutankhamun, later Tutankhamun, restored the old gods and abandoned Amarna. Temples to Amun were reopened. Akhenaten's name was erased from records, his statues smashed, and his legacy condemned. And yet, he remains one of the most enigmatic figures in ancient history. Was he a mystic or a tyrant, a prophet or an egotist? Whatever the answer, Akhenaten forced Egypt to ask what it had long resisted: can the divine be reinvented? And what happens when a king reshapes heaven in his own image? She has no tomb, no confirmed mummy. And yet, her face is one of the most iconic in the world, immortalized in a limestone bust discovered in 1912. Her neck long, her lips parted, her gaze calm and distant. She is Nefertiti. The beautiful one has come. And though she stood beside Akhenaten during one of Egypt's most controversial periods, her own story is a maze of speculation and intrigue. Nefertiti was not just the consort of a heretic pharaoh, she was a queen of unusual presence and power. Her depictions during the Amarna period are unlike any other royal wife in Egyptian art. She's shown making offerings to Aten, leading ceremonies, and even smiting enemies, poses traditionally reserved for kings. Some carvings suggest she held the same spiritual authority as her husband, acting as a conduit between the god and the people. And yet, after 12 years of Akhenaten's reign, she vanishes from the record. Was she cast aside? Did she die suddenly from plague or childbirth? Or did she transform into something even more remarkable, a pharaoh in her own right? One of the most compelling theories in Egyptology is that Nefertiti and a shadowy figure known as Neferneferuaten are the same person. In the years after Akhenaten's death, and before Tutankhamun's ascension, inscriptions reference a female ruler who used both feminine and masculine royal titles. Was this Nefertiti continuing her husband's legacy, or perhaps trying to salvage it? Adding to the enigma is the possibility that Nefertiti outlived Akhenaten and ruled jointly or even briefly alone during a time of religious reversal and dynastic confusion. Yet no tomb definitively belonging to her has ever been found, nor a mummy identified with certainty. And here's a curious twist. Some scholars believe that the famous bust of Nefertiti, now in Berlin's Neues Museum, was never meant for public display. It lacks the left eye, possibly unfinished, and may have been a sculptor's model kept in a workshop. If so, its survival was an accident. And yet, it has become the face of ancient Egypt for millions around the world. But the bust also stirs controversy. Should it remain in Germany, or be returned to Egypt? The debate over its rightful home echoes larger questions of cultural heritage, colonialism, and the modern legacy of ancient empires. Beneath the surface, though, is a deeper question: who was Nefertiti? Was she a loyal wife swept into her husband's revolution, or was she its architect, a woman of theological ambition and political will? Some suggest she was a foreign princess. Others believe she was of Egyptian noble birth, perhaps even a cousin or half-sister to Akhenaten. Her 6 daughters, shown frequently in art, hint at a royal household that blended familial intimacy with public symbolism, and yet, despite the prominence of her image, her final years remain shrouded in silence. Her disappearance around year 12 of Akhenaten's reign coincides with turbulent changes, deaths in the royal family, possible plagues, and the rise of successor figures. Could she have assumed a new identity to preserve continuity in a fractured court? Or, as some more speculative voices suggest, did political enemies erase her to reassert the old gods and restore orthodoxy? What is clear is this Nefertiti was not a decorative consort. She was a co-ruler in one of Egypt's boldest and most fragile moments. Whether as queen or king, priestess or power behind the throne, she remains a symbol of grace wrapped in mystery. And in the silence of the tombs she never claimed. Her legacy still echoes not through inscriptions, but through questions. In the long procession of Egypt's pharaohs, Tutankhamun was a minor figure, a boy king who reigned for less than a decade and died before reaching adulthood. His military campaigns were few, his monuments modest, and yet his name is known around the world. Not because of what he did in life, but because of what was left behind in death. Tutankhamun ascended the throne around 1332 BCE, likely at the age of 9. He was born Tutankhaten, living image of Aten, but as the political and religious winds shifted, he changed his name to Tutankhamun, living image of Amun. The boy king was the symbolic figurehead of Egypt's restoration, a return to orthodoxy after the radicalism of Akhenaten. The real power during his reign likely lay with his advisor's Eye, a senior courtier who may have been his maternal grandfather, and Horemheb, a military general with ambitions of his own. Together, they oversaw the re-establishment of temples to Amun, the reopening of traditional cult centres, and the removal of Akhenaten's memory from the public record. But for all this restoration, Tutankhamun's own life was frail. CT scans of his mummy reveal a figure with a clubfoot, scoliosis, and evidence of multiple congenital conditions, possibly the result of inbreeding within the royal family. He died suddenly at around 18 or 19 years old. The cause remains debated. Some point to an infected leg fracture, others to malaria or genetic disorders. No evidence of murder has ever been proven. What followed was one of the most hurried burials in royal history. Tutankhamun was laid to rest in a small tomb, likely not intended for a pharaoh hastily painted, with walls that cracked and faded within weeks. Many of the objects in his burial chamber appear reused or repurposed from other royal stock. His golden mask may have originally been made for someone else, perhaps even Nefertiti, and yet this accident of history preserved his memory, because the tomb was small, quickly sealed, and buried beneath debris from later constructions in the Valley of the Kings. It escaped centuries of tomb robbers. When British archaeologist Howard Carter broke into it in 1922, he found a treasure untouched over 5,000 objects, gold shrines, chariots, thrones, board games, food containers, and even the boys' linen underwear. One of the most unexpected items, a dagger made from meteoric iron, a symbol of divine power literally forged from the stars. The discovery sparked global fascination. King Tut became a household name. The opulence of his tomb reshaped the modern world's image of ancient Egypt, an image of gold, mystery, and divine kingship. But scholars still debate his historical importance. Was he a puppet ruler, manipulated by elder statesmen, or did his reign, even in its brevity, mark a deliberate and symbolic return to tradition? Some argue that the restoration of Amun under Tutankhamun laid the groundwork for the stable reigns that followed. Others believe his impact was purely posthumous, a footnote elevated by luck. There is also controversy over his burial. After Tutankhamun's death, I took the throne and likely oversaw the funeral. Was this done out of duty or ambition? Did I bury the boy quickly to secure his own claim to power? Whatever the political machinations, one thing is certain: Tutankhamun's tomb offered modern archaeology a unique gift, a complete royal burial, undisturbed, from Egypt's golden age. It's a time capsule of life, belief, and death, the mundane and the divine intertwined. Even his own coffin reflects that blend, a simple wooden sarcophagus, encased within ever larger gilded shrines, each layer forming a barrier between the king's body and the world, a final fortress of eternity. Tutankhamun may not have built temples or conquered lands, but in death he shaped how we remember the ancient world. His legacy is not in laws or battles, but in the echo of footsteps that crossed the threshold of a sealed tomb and found a civilization waiting on the other side. If Egypt had an Achilles, a towering figure of courage, pride, and ambition, it was Ramesses II, known as Ramesses the Great. He reigned for 66 years, fathered more than 100 children, and covered Egypt with his image, name, and temples. For many, he is the pharaoh, the face of Egyptian power, confidence, and endurance. His reign, beginning around 1279 BCE, came during the 19th dynasty and marked the apex of New Kingdom glory. And nothing illustrates his blend of myth and might better than the Battle of Kadesh, one of the most documented military encounters in the ancient world. The enemy was the Hittite Empire, centered in Anatolia. Kadesh, a fortified city in what is now Syria, was a strategic flashpoint. Ramesses, eager to assert Egyptian dominance in the region, led his army northward. But the Hittites, led by King Muwatalli II, had planned an ambush. According to Ramesses' own inscriptions, which he carved on nearly every temple wall he could commission, the Egyptians were nearly overwhelmed. His army had been split, misled by enemy scouts. With only his elite guard by his side, Ramesses claimed he leapt into his chariot and charged into battle alone, driving back thousands and turning the tide through sheer divine strength. In reality, the battle ended in a stalemate. Both sides suffered heavy losses, and neither gained control of Kadesh, but Ramesses declared victory and immortalized it in stone. On temple walls from Abu Simbel to Karnak, reliefs show the pharaoh towering over his enemies, drawing his bow with godlike force. In these scenes, the Hittites flee in panic, while Ramesses stands unshaken, surrounded by divine aura. His official scribe called it the greatest victory ever won by man. Here lies the controversy: was Kadesh truly a victory, or the earliest known case of political spin? Some historians suggest that the inscriptions were designed not to deceive, but to reassure projecting strength in a time of geopolitical uncertainty. And remarkably, years later, the conflict gave way to diplomacy. Ramesses and the Hittite king signed what many consider the world's first known peace treaty. A copy of it, carved in cuneiform, now hangs in the United Nations headquarters. Beyond the battlefield, Ramesses ruled with theatrical grandeur. He constructed more temples than any other pharaoh, most famously the colossal rock-cut sanctuary at Abu Simbel, where 4 seated statues of the king stare across the Nubian frontier. Inside, statues of gods and Ramesses himself share equal space. One particularly curious detail: Abu Simbel was engineered so that twice a year, the sun's rays would illuminate the inner sanctuary, lighting up the statues within. These moments aligned with dates likely tied to the king's coronation and birth cosmological architecture used to reinforce divine kingship. Ramesses' capital city, Pi-Ramesses, was a bustling metropolis of foreign embassies, chariot workshops, and trade. It symbolized Egypt's integration into an interconnected Near Eastern world, no longer just isolated by desert, but entangled in diplomacy, warfare, and alliance. Still, for all his power, Ramesses' legacy remains complex. Some see him as a narcissist, a ruler obsessed with self-glorification. Others view him as a stabilizer, one who preserved Egypt's borders and fostered peace through sheer force of personality. The debate continues, especially among those who try to connect Ramesses II with the unnamed pharaoh of the biblical Exodus, a link that remains unproven, but endlessly explored. Regardless, Ramesses II left behind something few rulers ever achieved: the illusion of permanence. His temples still stand, his statues still gaze across the sands, and in the tombs of the later pharaohs, his name was invoked as a model to emulate and a standard few could match. He may not have conquered Kadesh, but he conquered time. In the golden light of the new kingdom, Egypt was more than a land of gods and monuments. It was a node in a vast international network, a player in the earliest known global system of trade, diplomacy, and cultural exchange. And unlike the sword-wielding imperialism of other ancient powers, Egypt often expanded its influence not through conquest, but through negotiation and gift-giving, backed by a treasury filled with gold. At the heart of this interconnected world were the Amarna letters, over 380 clay tablets inscribed with diplomatic correspondence, discovered in the ruins of Akhenaten's short-lived capital. Written mostly in Akkadian, the diplomatic lingua franca of the time, these letters capture the voices of kings, princes, and courtiers across the ancient Near East, from Babylon to Hatti to the city-states of Canaan. Their tone is revealing. Foreign rulers address the pharaoh as "my brother," a ceremonial title indicating diplomatic parity. They beg for gold, offer brides, request armies, and complain of late gifts. In one letter, the king of Mitanni gently scolds the Egyptian court for sending too little gold with their last shipment. Another ruler boasts of the fine horses he has bred, hoping to entice an Egyptian envoy. The picture that emerges is not one of Egypt as an isolated monolith, but as an empire deeply enmeshed in a world of shifting alliances, cultural exchange, and economic interdependence. One surprising fact: Egypt exported very little gold, but had vast supplies of it. The mines of Nubia, especially in the eastern desert, provided a nearly limitless stream of the precious metal. In fact, to many foreign courts, Egypt's greatest value wasn't its military or religion, it was its gold. So much so that gold was often referred to as the breath of Egypt. And Egypt didn't just export treasure, it imported ideas. Foreign gods like Reshef, Baal, and Astarte found their way into Egyptian temples. Canaanite jewelry styles became fashionable in elite circles. Syrian musicians performed in the courts of Thebes. Meanwhile, diplomatic marriages tied Egypt to kingdoms far beyond the Nile. Pharaohs often accepted foreign brides, daughters of Babylonian or Hittite kings, though notably. Egyptian princesses were never given away in return. The pharaoh was to be the receiver, not the giver, of royal bloodlines, a subtle but firm statement of superiority. Still, not all exchanges were peaceful. In times of famine, vassal states wrote desperate pleas for grain. In times of rebellion, governors called for military intervention. The very same letters that celebrated gift-giving also warned of shifting loyalties and brewing wars. Egypt, while powerful, could not take its influence for granted. Therein lies the scholarly debate: was Egypt truly global, or was its foreign policy transactional, aimed purely at self-preservation? Some argue that the Amarna system represents the first true international order with rules, treaties, shared languages, and diplomatic norms. Others counter that it was more like a patchwork of temporary arrangements, dependent on personalities and constantly at risk of collapse. Regardless, what's clear is that Egypt saw itself not as one among many, but as the centre of the world, the land where the gods had chosen to dwell, where the Nile flowed in perfect harmony, and where chaos was always kept at bay. And yet, paradoxically, it needed the outside world. For timber, copper, horses, incense, and prestige, Egypt relied on its neighbours, even as it depicted them as bowing before its throne. The temples may have shown foreign princes offering tribute, but the storerooms of those same temples were filled with imported goods. Egypt's glory was not only built from its own soil, it was woven from the threads of an interconnected world. In that sense, Egypt was not merely ancient, it was global, a civilization that understood, long before the modern age, that power could be exercised not just through force but through exchange. By the late 13th century BCE, the Egyptian empire stood like a colossus grand, gilded and seemingly eternal. But beneath the polished stone of its monuments, stress fractures had begun to form. And then, almost as if from the sea itself, a wave of destruction rolled over the eastern Mediterranean, toppling cities, burning palaces, and bringing centuries-old kingdoms to their knees. Egypt called them the Sea Peoples. Their origins remain one of history's great mysteries. The Egyptians named them the Shurden, the Shekelesh, the Lukka, the Peliset. Some may have come from the Aegean, others from Anatolia or the Levant. They arrived in fleets, armed with bronze swords, horned helmets, and the kind of desperation that often follows famine, collapse, or displacement. Between 1200 and 1175 BCE, this confederation of raiders and migrants devastated coastal cities from Greece to Anatolia to Syria. The great palace cultures of the Mycenaeans and Hittites crumbled. Ugarit vanished. Trade routes withered. The interconnected late Bronze Age world, the very system that Egypt had helped to shape, fell into darkness. Egypt was not spared. In the reign of Ramesses III, around 1177 BCE, the Sea Peoples struck at the Nile Delta. The Pharaohs' inscriptions, especially those at Medinet Habu, depict fierce naval battles, chaos on the shores, and mass deportations of captured enemies. Ramesses claimed a decisive victory, boasting that Egypt was made as one with the land. But the truth was more complicated. While the delta was defended, Egypt never regained its former strength. Grain shortages, strikes by workers at Deir el-Medina, and dwindling foreign tribute signalled deeper cracks in the imperial facade. One curious and unsettling record, a letter from a high priest begging the pharaoh for grain, noting that even temple staff were starving. It's one of the first known examples of a state bureaucracy pleading for emergency relief, and a sign that even the most sacred institutions were struggling. This period, known as the Late Bronze Age collapse, remains a subject of intense scholarly debate. What caused such widespread destruction? Was it climate change, prolonged droughts leading to crop failure? Was it internal revolt, as overextended empires buckled under their own weight? Or was it simply the domino effect as trade collapsed? Economies followed. As economies failed, governments fell. Most likely. It was all of these a perfect storm of environmental stress, migration pressure, and political fragility, and Egypt, though it survived, was never the same. Here lies the controversy: did Ramesses III truly preserve Egyptian civilization, or did he merely delay the inevitable? In many ways, the new kingdom was already living on borrowed time. Power had become increasingly concentrated in the hands of priests, especially those of Amun. Tombs were being robbed with alarming frequency, sometimes by the very workers who built them. The centralized authority that had once overseen vast building projects now struggled to distribute grain, and yet Egypt endured not because of conquest, but because of resilience. The Nile still rose, the temples still echoed with prayers, but the world beyond the river had changed. The Eastern Mediterranean was no longer a network of glittering palaces and bronze-armoured envoys. It was now a landscape of smaller, more fractured societies, and Egypt had to adapt. In the wake of the Sea Peoples, Egypt retracted into itself. No longer an empire, it became a kingdom proud, isolated, and increasingly introspective. Still, even in retreat, it remembered. The temples of Karnak and Luxor continued to grow. Pharaohs still carved their names into stone, and in that act of inscription of declaring presence in a world of fading light, Egypt revealed its truest strength memory. It could not stop the tide, but it could write its story in the sand. In the centuries following the New Kingdom's decline, Egypt entered one of its most complex and fragmented eras. Power shifted, fractured, and reassembled in surprising forms. The Nile Valley was no longer ruled solely by native-born Egyptians. Instead, new players entered the scene: Libyans from the west and Nubians from the south, both of whom would claim not only the land of the pharaohs, but their legacy. By the 10th century BCE, Libyan chieftains who had long settled in Egypt rose to power, founding the 22nd and 23rd dynasties. They adopted Egyptian titles, performed temple rituals, and ruled from cities like Tanis and Bubastis in the delta. Their presence marked a cultural blending, as foreign-born elites fully embraced the institutions and symbols of Egyptian rule. Yet Egypt was no longer a unified kingdom. The high priest of Amun held enormous sway in Thebes. Local governors wielded real autonomy. Kings came and went, sometimes ruling simultaneously in different regions. Egypt had become a patchwork quilt, colourful, intricate, but fraying at the edges. And then came the Nubians, to the south, in the land Egypt had once dominated and mined for gold. A new power was rising. The kingdom of Kush, centred at Napata near the Fourth Cataract, had absorbed centuries of Egyptian culture. Its rulers worshipped Amun, built pyramids, spoke Egyptian, and read hieroglyphs. But they were not imitators, they were heirs, and they believed they could restore the divine order Egypt had lost. In the 8th century BCE, a Kushite king named Piye or Pianki marched north. He defeated rival warlords and delta rulers, but instead of razing cities, he purified temples, reinstated priests, and issued proclamations of moral righteousness. His famous Victory Stela, inscribed in elegant hieroglyphs, is less a military boast than a spiritual manifesto. In it, Piye scolds Egyptian princes for their impiety and corruption, and declares himself the rightful restorer of Ma'at. Thus began the 25th dynasty, the Nubian dynasty, a remarkable moment when Egypt was ruled from the south. Piye's successors, including Shabaka, Taharqa, and Tantamani, governed from both Memphis and Napata. They undertook ambitious building projects, particularly in Thebes, where they renovated temples and erected colossal statues in classic New Kingdom style. Under Taharqa, the empire briefly expanded, even resisting Assyrian advances in the Near East. A curious and often overlooked fact: Nubian pharaohs built pyramids not massive like those of Giza, but steep-sided, clustered structures at sites like El Kuru and Nuri. In doing so, they revived an ancient tradition Egypt itself had long abandoned. They reached into the past to legitimize the present, but the world was changing fast. The Assyrian Empire, aggressive, militarized, and technologically advanced, began pressing westward. In 671 BCE, Assyrian king Esarhaddon invaded Egypt. Taharqa resisted fiercely, but ultimately Memphis fell. The Assyrians installed puppet rulers, and although the Nubians would briefly return under Tantamani, their grip was broken. The 25th dynasty had ended not in disgrace, but in overwhelming force. And here arises the debate whether Nubians foreign usurpers or saviours of Egyptian tradition. Some older narratives frame them as outsiders, even invaders. But modern scholarship has shifted. The Nubians saw themselves not as conquerors, but as restorers. They spoke Egyptian, worshipped Egyptian gods, honoured Egyptian ancestors. Their rule was conservative, religious, and revivalist, often more faithful to tradition than native rulers had been in centuries. Even their political ideology was steeped in Egyptian thought. They did not abolish the priesthood or dismantle the temples, they amplified them, and their memory was preserved in the monuments they left behind, which still stand in Sudan today, a mirror of Egypt's own ancient soul. In the long ebb and flow of Egyptian power, the Nubians proved a profound truth. Influence doesn't always flow from conqueror to conquered. Sometimes it flows backward from pupil to teacher and returns transformed. By the 4th century BCE, Egypt was once again divided, vulnerable, coveted, and ripe for conquest. The last native Egyptian dynasties had crumbled, worn down by Persian rule and internal decay. And then, in 332 BCE, a new force arrived. Not from the desert or the sea, but from the mountains of Macedonia. Alexander the Great, fresh from his victories over the Persian Empire, entered Egypt without bloodshed. The Persian satrap fled, and the people welcomed Alexander not as a destroyer, but as a liberator. In their eyes, he was the avenger of Persian desecration, a foreigner. Yes, but one who respected Egyptian tradition. Alexander moved swiftly to secure legitimacy. He made offerings at the Temple of Amun in Siwa Oasis, where the oracle is said to have greeted him as a son of the god of Pharaoh in the eyes of the divine. The symbolic value of this moment was immense. Egypt, whose rulers had long claimed divine descent, now accepted a Greek as both king and god. In 331 BCE, he founded a new city, Alexandria, at the edge of the Mediterranean, on a stretch of coast once inhabited only by fishermen. It would become one of the greatest cities of the ancient world, a beacon of Hellenistic culture, science, commerce, and scholarship. But Alexander did not linger. Egypt was just one jewel in his expanding crown. Within a year, he marched east toward Babylon, leaving his general Cleomenes in charge. And after Alexander's death in 323 BCE, his empire splintered. Egypt fell into the hands of one of his most capable generals, Ptolemy, son of Lagus. Ptolemy declared himself pharaoh in 305 BCE, founding the Ptolemaic dynasty, which would rule Egypt for nearly 300 years. Here began a cultural fusion unlike anything Egypt had seen before. The Ptolemies were Greek ethnically, linguistically, and culturally, but they ruled as pharaohs, donning traditional regalia, performing sacred rituals, and commissioning temples to the Egyptian gods. They promoted the worship of Serapis, a syncretic deity blending elements of Osiris and Greek gods like Zeus and Hades, a god equally legible to Greek and Egyptian worshippers. One of their boldest projects was the Library of Alexandria, a scholarly dream intended to collect all the world's knowledge. At its height, it may have held over 400,000 scrolls. Philosophers, mathematicians, poets, and scientists flocked to the Mausion, the temple of the muses, to study language, astronomy, medicine, and history. Here's a curious fact: the library's agents were instructed to seize any written work brought into the city. Ships docked at Alexandria's harbour were searched, and their manuscripts copied. The originals were often kept. Knowledge was no longer just power, it was a possession. But Alexandria was not just intellectual, it was cosmopolitan. Greeks, Egyptians, Jews, Syrians, and Nubians lived and worked together, building a complex society where cultural lines blurred and tensions simmered. And herein lies a persistent scholarly debate. Did the Ptolemies preserve Egyptian culture or hollow it out? Some argue that their rule was exploitative. They maintained a Greek ruling class, reserved key positions for Hellenes, and treated native Egyptians as second-class citizens. Others contend that their pragmatic syncretism and massive temple-building campaigns, such as those at Edfu and Dendera, kept ancient traditions alive longer than they otherwise would have survived. Under Ptolemy II and III, Egypt reached new heights of learning and infrastructure. The Rosetta Stone, carved under Ptolemy Thesp, would much later unlock the key to understanding hieroglyphs and with it, the voice of ancient Egypt. But there was fragility beneath the surface. The Ptolemaic system depended on a delicate balancing act presenting Greek authority as compatible with native piety, all while navigating internal dynastic feuds, economic pressures, and rising Roman interest in the Mediterranean. Still, the fusion they created, Egyptian myth and Greek logic, native gods and imported ideas, left a legacy that shaped the intellectual history of the West. Medicine, astronomy, geometry, theology all passed through the crucible of Hellenistic Egypt. In the land of pyramids, the Greeks had found both a crown and a classroom, and in Alexandria, under the gaze of Serapis and the scent of papyrus scrolls, the ancient and the new briefly burned together brilliantly, if not forever. As the sun set on the Hellenistic world, a singular figure emerged from the final pages of Egypt's ancient history, a woman whose legend would eclipse her legacy, whose intellect matched her beauty, and whose life unfolded like a tragic play on the world stage. Her name was Cleopatra VII, born in 69 BCE. Cleopatra was not Egyptian by blood, but Macedonian Greek. The last ruler in the Ptolemaic line descended from one of Alexander the Great's generals. Yet she became more Egyptian in spirit and image than any of her predecessors. Unlike the earlier Ptolemies, she learned the native language, adopted the garb of Isis, and embraced her role as pharaoh not only to rule Egypt, but to become Egypt. When Cleopatra ascended to the throne alongside her brother-husband Ptolemy III, Egypt was a fading power in a Roman-dominated world. Rome had grown from republic to empire in the making, and Egypt's grain, ports, and gold were all under Roman eyes. Civil war broke out in Alexandria. Cleopatra, pushed from power, fled and then made a legendary return. According to Plutarch, she was smuggled into Julius Caesar's quarters wrapped in a rug, revealing herself dramatically to the Roman general. Whether this story is true or mythologized, it symbolizes her gift for performance and persuasion. Cleopatra aligned herself with Caesar, bore him a son, Caesarion, and briefly restored Egypt's autonomy. Her court shimmered with learning and luxury. She was fluent in multiple languages, a student of philosophy, and an astute political strategist. Far from the seductive temptress painted by Roman propaganda, she was a ruler who held a fragile state together amid continental upheaval. But after Caesar's assassination in 44 BCE, Cleopatra's world tilted again. Enter Mark Antony Caesar's protégé, and 1/3 of Rome's new ruling triumvirate. Cleopatra and Antony's alliance, political and romantic, electrified the ancient world. Their relationship produced 3 children, and a shared vision of a Greco-Egyptian empire that might challenge Rome itself. The two established their eastern court at Alexandria, where coins bore their likenesses side by side. Cleopatra was hailed as the new Isis, Antony as Dionysus reborn. They ruled as divine sovereigns, half in myth, half in defiance. But their ambitions alarmed Rome. Octavian, later Augustus, declared war. The climactic moment came at the naval battle of Actium in 31 BCE. Antony and Cleopatra's forces were outmaneuvered and outnumbered. Their fleet broke, and their hopes with it. Back in Alexandria, facing certain defeat, they chose death over capture. Antony fell on his sword. Cleopatra, according to legend, arranged for a venomous asp to bite her, a symbolic act tying her final breath to the goddess Isis. Rome entered the city not as a conqueror, but as an inheritor. With Cleopatra's death in 30 BCE, Egypt ceased to be a kingdom. It became a Roman province. The line of pharaohs stretching over 3 millennia ended with her. Here lies the enduring debate: was Cleopatra a reckless seductress, as Roman historians claimed, or was she the last pharaoh fighting to preserve Egypt's sovereignty in a world collapsing into empire? Modern historians lean toward the latter. Cleopatra understood the power dynamics of her time and maneuvered as best she could. She used alliance, marriage, culture, and theology to project stability. Her tragedy was not in failing, but in being born at the edge of an unstoppable Roman tide. A lesser-known fact, her son Caesarion, briefly declared pharaoh by loyalists, was captured and executed by Octavian's agents, an act that sealed both the death of the dynasty and the consolidation of Roman rule. And yet, Cleopatra's image endured. For centuries, she was painted and repainted as goddess, villain, lover, scholar, queen. Shakespeare would romanticize her. Hollywood would glamorize her. But beneath the myth lies a simple truth: she was the final voice of a civilization that had outlived empires, rewritten time, and built eternity in stone. With her, the Nile's ancient sovereignty was eclipsed but never forgotten. When Octavian, soon to become Augustus, annexed Egypt in 30 BCE, he did more than conquer a kingdom. He absorbed one of the most enduring and culturally distinct civilizations the world had ever seen. The land of the pharaohs, temples, and gods was now a province in an empire built on roads and legions. But Egypt's story didn't end. It shifted, adapted, and, in many ways, persisted beneath the marble veneer of Rome. Augustus declared Egypt his personal property, separate from the Senate's control. This was no symbolic gesture. Egypt was the breadbasket of the empire, feeding Rome with its grain. Whoever controlled Egypt controlled the Mediterranean economy, and Augustus knew it. Senators were barred from even entering the province without the emperor's permission. In Alexandria, Roman governors ruled from palaces once occupied by the Ptolemies. The city remained a hub of learning and commerce, second only to Rome in size and prestige. Its great library, though damaged by fires and neglect, still drew scholars. Greek remained the administrative language, blending with Coptic and remnants of Demotic script. And yet, deep in the Nile Valley, the old ways endured. Temples to Amun, Isis, and Horus continued to function. Priests performed rituals. Festivals honoured the turning of the stars. Roman emperors, beginning with Augustus himself, were depicted in pharaonic garb on temple walls, offering to Egyptian gods in the traditional poses. They understood the need for continuity. Egypt was too ancient, too sacred to be remade from scratch. Here's a fascinating detail: the cult of Isis, born in Egyptian soil, became one of the most popular religions in the Roman world. Shrines to her rose in Pompeii, Gaul, and even London. Her worshippers carried sistrums, wore linen robes, and invoked her as the universal mother-protector of sailors, giver of wisdom, guardian of the dead. In a strange twist, Egypt's native deities outlived its native kings, thriving under foreign skies. But life for ordinary Egyptians changed. Roman taxation was severe. Peasants were bound to the land, often unable to move or marry without permission. Local revolts flared in Upper Egypt, especially among communities loyal to native traditions. These were met with brutal suppression, and the temples, though still revered, began to fade. Over time, priests lost their land holdings, donations shrank. Some temples fell into disuse, others were converted for new purposes. The slow erosion of the old religion came not from edict, but from economics and indifference. Still, Egyptian architecture left its mark. Roman obelisks, many quarried in earlier dynasties, were transported across the empire. One stands in the heart of Paris, another graces St. Peter's Square in the Vatican. They became symbols of imperial power, even as their hieroglyphs were no longer understood. Scholarly debate continues: did Rome preserve Egyptian culture, or repurpose it for spectacle? Some argue that Roman Egypt was little more than a cultural fossil, picturesque but hollowed out. Others see in the temples, art, and religious fusion a continuity that speaks to Egypt's resilience. The truth likely lies between a civilization preserved in part, diluted in others, yet never fully extinguished. A revealing moment came in 391 CE when Emperor Theodosius I, a Christian, ordered the closure of pagan temples throughout the empire. In Egypt, this meant the final silencing of priestly chants in places like Philae and Edfu. Statues were broken, altars desecrated, a world ended. But not entirely. Egyptian tradition had already begun to shift into new forms. Coptic Christianity absorbed many native beliefs, the veneration of saints, pilgrimage rituals, the importance of holy rivers and sacred images. Even in silence, Egypt's voice found new tongues. It is easy to draw a line at Cleopatra's death or the Christianization of the empire and declare an end. But cultures do not vanish. They transform. They whisper beneath the surface. Rome may have ruled Egypt, but Egypt haunted Rome. 2,000 years after the last pharaoh's breath faded into desert silence, Egypt continued to speak in symbols, in structures, in stories that refused to die. Though its temples fell silent and its gods were forgotten, the civilization that rose beside the Nile left behind something more enduring than gold, a legacy so deeply woven into the human imagination that we still walk in its shadow. It took the world centuries to begin decoding that legacy. In 1799, near the town of Rosetta, French soldiers under Napoleon's command unearthed a broken slab of black stone inscribed with 3 scripts: Greek, Demotic, and hieroglyphic. This fragment, the Rosetta Stone, would become the key to unlocking the ancient language of Egypt. In 1822, the French scholar Jean-François Champollion cracked the code, using the Greek text to decode the phonetic system behind the symbols. With this, the voices of the ancient Egyptians returned not just the names of kings, but their prayers, laws, tax records, and love songs. A civilization long buried was now readable again. But the story of Egypt's rediscovery is not without shadows. Many of the great finds of Egyptology tombs, statues, papyri ended up in European museums. Colonial powers excavated, exported, and often exploited Egyptian heritage for prestige and profit. Today, debates rage over the rightful ownership of artifacts like the Rosetta Stone, the bust of Nefertiti, and countless mummies held in foreign collections. Was Egyptology an act of reverence or appropriation? Scholars continue to wrestle with this legacy. But amid the debate, there is also wonder, for Egypt gave the world more than treasures. It shaped how we think about time, eternity, and the meaning of civilization. The Egyptians were not the first to build cities, but they were among the first to make memory itself sacred. They etched the lives of kings into granite and gold. They measured time with the stars, crafting calendars so precise that their echoes survive in our months and agricultural seasons. Their medicine catalogued hundreds of remedies from eye surgeries to dental drills long before Hippocrates. Their geometry and engineering laid foundations for architecture still studied today. Their myths influenced Greek thought, which in turn influenced the Roman world and, through it, us. But beyond the facts and dates, there's something harder to name: a mood, a sensibility, a spiritual architecture of the world. To the Egyptians, life was not a straight line, but a cycle. The sun died each night only to be reborn at dawn. The Nile flooded and receded. The soul journeyed through darkness to reach the field of reeds, and in this rhythm they found a meaning and built a civilization meant to outlast death itself. Even now, when we speak of eternity, we speak in Egyptian terms: pyramids, mummies, tombs that whisper secrets to the stars. One last curiosity: Napoleon, when shown the Rosetta Stone by his officers, is said to have remarked, "From the heights of these pyramids, 40 centuries look down upon us." His words were propaganda, yes, but also prophecy, because Egypt still looks down and through us. It appears in the obelisks of our cities, in the astrological signs of our horoscopes, in the word paper from papyrus, in the symbolism of resurrection and judgment, even in the architecture of our dreams. No civilization lasts forever in power, but some last in influence. Egypt did not just build a kingdom, it built an idea that through balance, ritual, and memory, humanity could touch the divine, and that idea still shapes the world.